So, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome.
We have Phil Martins with us today, and you are going to talk about truth during these days, in the panel about the we are.
Yes, I am. Yes, going to talk about truth
Ca-
and evidence-based information versus the mythology that some are seeking to create in the United States for the purpose of, well, that's what we'll discuss. Why are some trying to create a mythological set of assumptions in the United States as opposed to relying on evidence-based information?
You can make a comparison between U.S. and Europe. What do you think about the use of truth and how?
Well, I think all over the world right now, but especially in democratic nations, those that may not be perfect democracies, they may be what we might call imperfect democracies, but yet we have democratic norms. Those democratic norms are being undermined by lies. We like to call those lies disinformation or misinformation, but we need to call it what it is sometimes. These are lies. And lies are meant, as the philosopher Timothy Snyder says, philosopher and historian Timothy Snyder at Yale University, and as the philosopher Hannah Arendt says, they serve a purpose. When you seek to create a world based on lies, the purpose of those contradictions is to create, if you will, magical thinking. That magical thinking leads to the exceptions of certain assumptions that are what we would call falsehoods or lies. The purpose is to basically to garner support for individuals who could not garner that support democratically. They have to turn to other means. We call that authoritarianism. And in the United States, we're dealing with authoritarian figures. The most prominent is Donald Trump. He is an authoritarian in thinking. If he becomes president, he is in 2024, again, he is an authoritarian in waiting. How do I compare that to what's happening in Europe? Well, if you look at Meloni in Italy right now, she also has advanced what she often calls lies in reference to newspaper articles that might critique her unfavorably or report on her unfavorably. Forget the critique, but report on her unfavorably. This has become known as fake news around the world. That term is being used. It was coined, we believe, by Donald Trump, but it's been around for years. Orwell was aware of it in Great Britain during his era. He encountered all types of efforts to vilify the press. Those efforts came from authoritarians and totalitarians, with those in Soviet Russia, and of course those in Germany, and later, of course, in Nazi Germany. So it's not new, but the notion of fake news is meant to invalidate evidence-based truth. And my talk is focused on why there's this effort to delegitimize democratic norms by attacking evidence-based truths.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking about the collecting the data, for example, to build the truth, a proper truth. What do you think is always talking about our students who want to do this job as work as a journalist? Where do you think they have to start? What they don't have to miss? Good practice, for example.
They cannot miss the process of ascertaining truth. And the process begins with, as you pointed out, collecting data. It begins with interviews with an assortment of people in order to establish a picture of what's going on. It also is necessary to look through historical documents to understand what's going on. History is very important if you are going to communicate, because history has lessons, holds lessons for all of us. All those things we've heard from about Santayana and others, and all the references to the importance of history and the notion of not forgetting. Well, we actually often forget. The reason we often forget is because we really aren't, that is to say, most people aren't students of history. They're students of the moment and students of those things that make us comfortable. But the things that make us uncomfortable are often based on the historical record. And if we have the historical record, we have a much better idea of how to ask questions and how to proceed into the future in terms of priorities and of establishing what many people say they really want. Many people say they want democracy, but oftentimes they clamor for those things that only benefit their small collective or small community and dispossesses everyone else. And we know what that can lead to as we look historically at Germany, for example, 1932, heading into an authoritarian regime, a Nazi regime. We know that from the 1920s in Italy as Mussolini gained power. And now, of course, we're seeing, and it's important to report on this, we're seeing an Italy dominated by a ultra right-wing party where the population has essentially acceded to that by voting for this party. But it's democratic, but it's the vote is fine. That's what a democracy is all about. What we have to be aware of is how authoritarians use democracy to chip away at democracy, use freedom of speech to chip away at freedom of speech. We should be aware of that history as we're reporting. There are, of course, various sides to many issues. That doesn't mean those sides are correct or balanced or fair. If one side exists to take away the rights of another side, you don't report on that as, well, one side believes this and one side believes that. What you have to report is one side exists to take away your rights. And so you have to be very clear, explicit about what the lies represent and what the truth represents. It can't simply be reporting that someone told a lie and someone else told the truth. We have to figure out, as we're communicating, what is the basis and the reason for that lie? What is the end goal, the result? And why evidence-based information is necessary to counter those lies.
You are doing this job for the last 20 years. You won a lot of prizes, but I want to know, talking about what you just said, the digitalization, the new media, the huge use of social media and internet, and so the access to all this different information and where no one really knows when the audience don't really know what is not really aware of what they have in front of them. So do you think that this kind of massive amount of information and the fact that you can share this information, everyone can share their point of view, the information through social media, change the way that you are doing this job, or that you are telling and trying to inform people, because you are working in a news program, right? Radio program.
It's an excellent question, and it's an important question. When we think about the modalities of communicating, we think a bit, let's take again the example Orwell in the 1930s. The world at that point was dealing with a fairly relatively new form of communication, radio, relatively new. And radio was widespread, but that's how, and it achieved many extraordinary goals, but some of those goals were also nefarious. The fascists of Italy and the Nazis of Germany used radio to great advantage to promulgate a message of hate and antipathy toward Jews and other people, so on and so forth. It was very effective. But not everyone had a radio. And those who did also relied on other tools, such as newspapers, which quite often served to, and even newspapers weren't always, when I say evidence-based, let's just say relatively speaking, because the truth, many people believe truth can be subjective. Sadly, it can be. One person's truth, of course, can be another person's lie. If one person's truth is that another group of people, if a group of people fighting Franco in Spain are freedom fighters, that's the truth to them. Another group might have assumed that those fighting with Franco and for Franco in Spain were freedom fighters. Those are two different truths. But the fact of the matter is, one group was fighting for pro-fascist regime, but again, that's a fact. But for others, that was the truth. The truth was that they were, in their view, was that they were fighting for freedom. So that's my way of saying that newspapers reported that in various ways, and it sort of balanced the type of propaganda that you're also hearing via radio, widespread radio. Today, social media is far more widespread than radio ever was. Radio, of course, was massive, but there's nothing more ubiquitous right now than Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. Billions, not millions, billions of people have access to those platforms, and thus billions of people have access to disinformation and misinformation, because those platforms are complete with disinformation and misinformation. And it becomes necessary, therefore, for journalists to try to counter that which is real based on objective reality, ascertained through evidence that includes data and interviews and source material and any number of ways of ascertaining facts. And so we have a major job of trying to counter those things which are non-factual, promulgated on social media.
We are in October, and
Yes.
is the Black History Month here in Europe, apparently not in US.
Right. Well, we, in many ways, Black History Month is every month in the U.S.
Right, good point.
Because we assert ourselves. It's important to make it clear that Blackness is part of that which we call a multiracial democracy in the United States. It is what we'd like to consider as part of our pluralism. And of course, it hasn't always been that way. So it becomes important to assert it. But your question, please.
Well,
Yeah.
well, do you think that now, since we are in the communication talking, do you think that it's well taught, is well represented from, for example, in Europe, or how do you feel the representation of this particular month?
Yeah.
Okay, we are using this to make people aware and making aware about colonialism, about the importance of the heritage, but on even simple about the importance of talking about this topic. That is not really a thing yet.
It's
I
another
think.
important question you're asking. That's very good. In Europe, I think that Europe is a bit behind, of course, the United States in terms of awareness. And that's the key word, by the way, awareness. The reason that a Black History Month is even necessary, or a Indigenous Persons Month in, let's say, for example, in Australia. I'm not sure if they actually have that, but they should. If the reason these things are necessary is because, if not, individuals who contribute mightily to a country's development become an afterthought. We think about colonialism, of course, but we often think about it in terms of winners and losers, and not always think about it in terms of who contributed mightily to the development, for example, of Great Britain. And Great Britain would never have been great if not for the sweat, blood, tears, and toil of those people who were colonized. And subsequently, many of those same people in the aftermath of colonialism made their way to the UK, only to be victimized by far-rightists like Enoch Powell within UK society, but increasingly asserting themselves as part of the UK's fabric. And all over Europe, you find a Black presence. Many, and the majority, of course, people directly from Africa as opposed to just African descent. Many first-generation migrants, many second-generation migrants. Here in Italy, for example, Italy's history is it would not be told completely if we did not have a discussion about Italy's role in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia and Eritrea, throughout that region, and those people who eventually made their way to Italy from those same backgrounds. Of course, Italy was never really successful in its conquest in the Horn of Africa, to Mussolini's embarrassment. But it's part of the history, and that has to be told. And it's important to celebrate those folks who arrived on Italian shores, whose ancestors were victimized by Mussolini and by the Italian right, and with the support of the many Italian people, it should be said. And now, of course, we're in 2022, we see folks whose their descendants have arrived in Italy and are part of the fabric. Some are even city government in towns and cities throughout Italy. Very important to celebrate. The same is true throughout Europe, where you find, for example, in the Nordic countries, representatives of those communities, of those nations who've made their way to Oslo, or to Stockholm, or to Helsinki, and Amsterdam, and Paris. There's a lot of conflict also right now, because as immigration continues, much of it spurred by conditions like climate change, it becomes important for those who communicate these issues to ask, why are people coming, for example. And it's also important to ask why people came in the first place. It's important to connect the dots of colonialism and migration. It's important to connect the dots of countries that consider themselves democratic institutions and contradictions of the past with undemocratic solutions to economic despair that took place in the form of colonialism, for example. Colonialism is not an asterisk in European history. It is a full, massive blot on the continent's history, but it is the history, and it has to be taken into account when we're communicating about issues such as migration, immigration, and the continuity of democratic institutions.
So history stays really important.
That's right. History is always important.
It's the basic
That's right.
part where you have to start.
That's right. If someone is in communications and they do not have a firm grasp of history, that's a problem. Yeah, you cannot communicate without a firm grasp, communicate effectively as a journalist without a firm grasp of history.
Thank you, Philip.
You're welcome.
And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I should add one other thing. This year I'm a fellow at Harvard at the Shorenstein Center, and I'm focused on looking at individuals who are pushing back in the United States against authoritarianism and growing authoritarianism. And much of that movement began in Europe. We call it Antifa in the United States. In Europe, they call it Antifa. That's right. And it's quite interesting how that idea has developed in the United States, largely because the belief by people within that movement, which oftentimes is a violent movement in clashing with violent fascists on the ground. But they adopted the name many years ago, sensing something was happening in the United States that frankly many of us had not sensed before. I've always felt the term was hyperbolic to use the term fascism in the United States. But now for the first time, many of us see, including the President of the United States, that fascism has a real possibility of taking root in our country. It's a threat to everyone, and it's a threat to press freedoms. The very type of communication you and I are doing right now would not be possible and will not be possible if that type of system succeeds.
You're right. Do you want to add something for our students?
The students study hard, study history. Don't be afraid to pick up a mic and ask questions. And there's no such thing as a stupid question. Every question is important. And you learn from those questions. If you ask the wrong question, you think the first time, and someone else might think you asked the wrong question. Ask the right question the next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.